The silence in that operating room was so heavy, you could feel it pressing down on your chest. The monitors beeped a steady, indifferent rhythm, a stark contrast to the emotional earthquake we had just experienced. A 16-year-old girl, blind since birth, was being prepped for emergency surgery. The atmosphere was all clinical precision and quiet urgency. Then, just as the anesthesiologist was about to begin, she spoke. Her voice was clear, calm, and it cut through the sterile air like a knife. What she said in that moment, a simple string of words whispered into the bright, unseen void above her, didn't just surprise us. It stunned everyone into a profound, reverent silence, redefining everything I thought I knew about courage and sight. My name is Nurse Catherine, and in all my years of nursing, I had never witnessed a moment of such raw, heartbreaking humanity. The day had started like any other in the bustling corridors of the hospital, a symphony of squeaking shoes on linoleum, the distant pages over the intercom, and the low hum of countless lives in various states of repair. My assignment that morning was the pediatric wing, a place where the air often felt different, tinged with a unique blend of youthful resilience and profound vulnerability. It was there, in room 307, that I first met her. She had been admitted overnight, a transfer from a smaller clinic, and her file was sparse, marked with the stark clinical term, acute bilateral blindness congenital. Her name was Ilara. She was 16, but there was a stillness about her that made her seem both ancient and heartbreakingly young. The room was dim, the blinds drawn against the intrusive morning sun, as if the world itself was trying to be gentle with her. She was sitting up in bed, her hands resting palms up on the white sheets, her head tilted just slightly as if listening to a song only she could hear. Her long, dark hair fanned out over the pillow, and her unseeing eyes, a soft and clouded hazel, were fixed on some distant point in the room, not vacant, but deeply, intensely present. I introduced myself, my voice softer than usual, careful not to startle her. "Hello, Ilara. My name is Catherine. I'm going to be your nurse today." A small, knowing smile touched her lips. "Hello, Catherine," she said, her voice a clear, "Your footsteps are quick but light. You've been doing this a long time." I remember freezing for a second, my hand pausing as I reached for her chart. It was my first clue that Ilara perceived the world in a dimension the rest of us had forgotten. She didn't need sight to see. She mapped her surroundings with an intricate radar of sound, scent, and the subtle shifts in the energy around her. Over the next few hours, as I checked her vitals and adjusted her IV, a fragile routine began to form. She asked me about the texture of the wall paint, whether it was smooth or had a slight bumpy pattern. She asked about the scent of the disinfectant, identifying the faint note of lemon beneath the harsh chemical smell. She was an architect, building a world inside her mind piece by piece, using the raw materials we, the seeing, took for granted. Her mother, a woman named Clara, with worry etched into the corners of her eyes, arrived mid-morning, her presence filling the room with a palpable wave of love and anxiety. She clutched Ilara's hand, her voice trembling as she spoke of the sudden, severe headaches that had prompted this admission, symptoms that were new and frightening. The doctors were concerned, their conversations hushed and serious outside the door. They spoke of pressure, of optic nerves, of things that should not be happening. Ilara, meanwhile, was the calm at the center of the gathering storm. She comforted her mother, her fingers gently tracing the lines on her palm. "It's okay, Mom. I can feel the sun is out today. The window is warm on this side of the room." In that small, dim space, I wasn't just a nurse performing tasks. I was a witness to a profound kind of grace. I watched her navigate the small universe of her hospital room with a quiet dignity that left me humbled. She knew the exact number of steps from her bed to the bathroom, the specific sound of my particular medication cart rolling down the hall, the difference between the intern's rushed, nervous gait and the attending physician's confident, measured stride. She was compiling a library of sounds, a catalog of textures, creating a reality that was rich and detailed and entirely her own. The initial plan was for observation, for scans and tests to unravel the mystery of her new symptoms. The atmosphere, while concerned, was not yet one of panic. There was a fragile hope that whatever was happening could be managed, that this was a temporary complication in a life already adapted to a different rhythm. I remember thinking how incredibly brave she was, facing this new, invisible threat with the same quiet resolve she faced everything else. Little did I know that this quiet morning of gentle observations and soft-spoken conversations was merely the calm, the deep breath before the plunge into a crisis that would test the limits of that very bravery and challenge the very definition of what it means to truly see. The world of Room 307, with its dim light and whispered reassurances, was about to be shattered, and the journey that began with the mapping of a room through sound was rushing headlong toward a blinding, silent operating room where a single sentence would change everything. The fragility of that morning shattered with the abrupt, shrill ring of the phone at the nurse's station. The calm, methodical rhythm of the ward instantly snapped into something taut and electric. It was Dr. Evans, his voice, usually so measured, sharp with urgency. He had reviewed Alara's latest scans. The situation was no longer about observation, it was about intervention, and it was about time. The pressure inside her skull was building at an alarming, dangerous rate, a silent tsunami threatening to cause irreversible damage. Emergency echoed down the hall, a cold splash of reality that sent a team of us moving with a synchronized, silent speed I hadn't felt in years. The gentle world Alara had so carefully built in Room 307 was about to be dismantled in a whirlwind of clinical necessity. I was the one who had to go back in, who had to tell her and her mother that the plan had changed, that the gentle probing was over. Walking back into that dim room felt like crossing a border into a different country, one where the air was suddenly too thin to breathe. Clara was still holding Alara's hand, and she looked up at me, her eyes searching my face for any clue, any shred of the hope we had all been clinging to just minutes before. I didn't need to say anything. The change in my energy, the slight quickening of my breath, the new tension in my shoulders, Alara perceived it all instantly, her head tilted, her clouded eyes seeming to look right through me. "Something's wrong," she stated. It was a statement of fact, not a question. I knelt beside her bed, my voice low and as steady as I could make it, explaining that the doctors had found something that needed to be addressed right away, that they needed to take her to surgery to help with the pressure, to make the pain go away. I used simple, clear words, but there is no simple way to deliver news like that. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, a choked sob escaping as she gripped her daughter's hand tighter, as if she could physically anchor her to this spot, to this moment before the unknown. But Alara simply nodded, a slow, accepting gesture. She reached out, her fingers finding her mother's tear-streaked cheek. "Don't cry, Mom," she whispered. "They're just going to fix the broken part. It will be okay." Her composure was otherworldly. In that moment, she was the adult, and we were the frightened children. The transition from the quiet of her room to the controlled chaos of pre-op was a blur of fluorescent lights, consent forms, and the brisk, efficient movements of the surgical team. I stayed by her side, my role shifting from caregiver to anchor, a familiar presence in a sea of new voices and terrifying sounds. The anesthesiologist, a kind-faced man named Dr. Rossi, began his explanation of the process, his voice a gentle monotone meant to soothe. He talked about counting backward, about a deep sleep. Ilara listened intently, her face a mask of serene concentration. They began to transfer her from the gurney to the cold, hard surface of the operating table. The room was a symphony of preparation, the clatter of instruments being laid out, the hiss of the sterilizing agents, the soft, rhythmic beep of the monitors being connected to her, each wire and tube another tether to this new, frightening reality. The bright, unforgiving lights of the OR were switched on, bleaching all color from the scene, leaving only stark contrasts of white and steel and the pale blue of the surgical drapes. It was in this moment, this final precipice moment, before the veil of anesthesia was drawn, that the atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. The clinical chatter died down. The surgeons were scrubbing in at the sinks just outside the door, their murmured conversation a low hum. Dr. Rossi was preparing the sedative, the liquid clear and ominous in the syringe. He leaned over her, his voice soft. "Ilara, I'm going to start the medicine now. You'll start to feel very sleepy. Just try to relax." He was about to administer the first dose when she stirred. She turned her head slightly on the pillow, her unseeing eyes seeming to sweep across the ceiling, across the faces of the people she knew were there but had never seen. She took a small, quiet breath, and then she spoke. Her voice was not a whisper, but it was quiet, so clear and resonant it seemed to absorb all the other sounds in the room. "I know you're all looking at me," she began, and a profound hush fell instantly. Every movement ceased. "You're looking at me and you're thinking how sad it is that I've never seen a sunset, or my mother's face, or the color of the sky." She paused, and in that pause, you could have heard a pin drop onto the sterile floor. "But I want you to know something. I have seen them. I have seen the sunset in the warmth on my skin at the end of the day. I have seen my mother's face in the sound of her laughter and the way her hand feels when she holds mine. And I see the color of the sky every time I hear the rain fall, because I know it's the same gray that makes the world feel quiet and new." She let out a soft sigh, a sound of pure, unadulterated peace. "I'm not afraid of the dark. I live in a world of light you can only feel." The silence that followed was absolute. A vacuum of sound so complete it was deafening. Dr. Rossi's hand, holding the syringe, had frozen in midair. The scrub nurse, holding a tray of instruments, stood as still as a statue. My own breath caught in my throat, a lump forming so thick I thought I would choke. In a room full of people whose entire profession was dedicated to fixing what was broken, to restoring function and sight, a 16-year-old girl who had never used her eyes had just taught us all what vision truly means. She had redefined the entire concept of light, of color, of beauty, with a few simple, devastatingly profound sentences. The clinical urgency was still there. The pressure in her skull was still a ticking clock. But for one suspended, eternal moment, time itself seemed to stop and bear witness. I find myself thinking about that moment all the time, about how Ilara's perception of the world was so much richer and more vibrant than my own. It makes me wonder about the unique ways we all experience life. I'd love to know, from my heart to yours, what is one simple, everyday thing that fills your world with light and color. Maybe it's the smell of coffee in the morning, or the sound of your hometown coming to life, or the feeling of the soil in your garden. Please share with me in the comments below what is the sound or the scent or the feeling that paints your world beautiful. I'm genuinely curious to hear from you. The weight of her words lingered in the sterile air, a perfume of profound truth that made the sharp scent of antiseptic feel cheap and inadequate. For a handful of heartbeats, no one moved. We were all suspended in the gravity of her revelation, each of us prisoners in our own bodies, suddenly aware of the limitations of our own sight. Dr. Rossi was the first to break the spell, his training and duty overriding the sheer awe that had paralyzed him. He slowly, almost reverently, the anesthetic, his movements now imbued with a new kind of care, as if he were handling something sacred and not just a medical procedure. Ilara's eyes fluttered closed, her serene expression unchanged, as if she had simply shared a simple truth and was now ready for a nap. But the atmosphere in the room had been fundamentally altered. The frantic, ticking clock urgency was still present, a cold undercurrent of physiological reality, but it was now layered with a thick, respect. The surgeons entered, their hands held up in the sterile fashion, their eyes immediately scanning the monitors, but even their professional masks seemed slightly cracked, their gazes lingering on the small, peaceful figure on the table a moment longer than was strictly necessary. The procedure began, a complex and delicate dance of hands and instruments focused on relieving the catastrophic pressure inside her skull. But the usual detached clinical chatter was gone. I stood at my station, my role now one of support and observation, but my mind was reeling, trapped in the echo of Ilara's voice. I looked at the monitors displaying the internal landscape of her brain, the very thing that housed this incredible consciousness, and I felt a terrifying, vertiginous fear. What if they couldn't fix this? What if this unique, luminous perspective on the world was extinguished by a biological malfunction? The stakes, which were already life and death, now felt infinitely higher. It was no longer just about saving a girl's life. It was about preserving a universe. Her mother, Clara, was in the waiting room, and I knew her terror was a raw, physical thing, a prayer on a continuous loop. But I now carried a different kind of fear, one born from the understanding of exactly what could be lost. The surgery stretched on, minute by agonizing minute. The initial phase was going as planned. The surgeons navigating the intricate pathways with skill and precision. Reports were murmured, numbers were called out, and a fragile sense of cautious optimism began to tentatively bloom in the cold air. It felt, for a beautiful, brief moment, that the tide was turning, that Ilara's profound peace was a shield, and that her unique light would continue to shine. Then, without warning, it happened. The steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor stuttered. It didn't flatline, not yet. But it faltered, a hiccup in the song of life that sent a jolt of pure electricity through every person in the room. One of the surgeons, his voice tight and controlled, but edged with a new tension, spoke a single, dreaded word: bradycardia. Her heart rate was dropping. Suddenly, the focus shifted from the meticulous work on her brain to the more immediate, primal threat to her heart. The anesthesiologist's voice became sharper, calling out medications, adjusting dosages. The beeping, which had been a background metronome, now became the loudest, most terrifying sound in the universe. Each faltering beat a hammer against my soul. I watched the screen, the numbers dipping lower, and my own heart felt like it was trying to claw its way out of my chest. This was the point of no return, the great event that changed everything. We were no longer in a controlled procedure. We were in a fight. The conflict was no longer just against the pressure in her skull, but against the very real, very sudden possibility of her heart giving out under the strain. The calm that Alara had bestowed upon us evaporated, replaced by the raw, adrenaline-fueled battle that defines the edge between life and death. The surgeons worked faster, their movements a blur of desperate efficiency, trying to complete their task before the unthinkable happened. In that moment, the memory of her voice, "I live in a world of light you can only feel," clashed violently with the cold, hard reality of the failing numbers on the screen. The beautiful, fragile universe she had built in her mind was now under a direct physiological assault, and we were the only ones who could stand in the breach. The outcome was suddenly, terrifyingly uncertain. The next few minutes were a brutal, high-stakes ballet where every second stretched into an eternity, and every breath felt like a stolen gift. The initial bradycardia was not a fleeting anomaly, it was the first crack in the dam, a sign that Alara's young body was succumbing to the immense stress of the procedure. The steady beep of the monitor became a frantic, irregular drumbeat, a chaotic soundtrack to the silent, desperate battle unfolding on the other side of the surgical drape. My training kicked in, an autopilot of professionalism that was the only thing holding my own rising panic at bay. But beneath the surface, I was crumbling. I watched the surgeons, their brows furrowed in intense concentration, their voices a low, tense exchange of medical jargon that translated to a single, terrifying reality. They were losing her. They were trying to stabilize her, to complete the delicate work on her brain, while simultaneously fighting a collapsing cardiovascular system. A new medication was called for, something to support her crashing blood pressure, and my hands, though steady, felt like blocks of ice as I prepared the vial. The sound of the ampule snapping open was unnaturally loud in the hushed tension, a sharp crack that seemed to signify the breaking of something far more fragile than glass. As I passed the syringe to the anesthesiologist, my eyes met his for a fleeting second, and in them I saw a reflection of my own dread. This was no longer a routine complication. This was a nosedive. The numbers on the screen continued their terrifying descent, a digital countdown to a void I couldn't bear to contemplate. My mind, against my will, flashed back to her room, to the way she had mapped the texture of the wall, to the sound of her melodic voice identifying the lemon and the disinfectant. That intricate, beautiful world she had built was now teetering on the edge of annihilation, not from the outside, but from within her own body. The profound peace she had exuded felt like a cruel taunt now, a beautiful dream from which we were trying desperately to wake her. But the waking world was trying to claim her first. The lead surgeon's voice, usually a model of calm authority, tightened another notch. "We're not out of the woods. I need more exposure here. Suction." The whirring of the suction device added a new, ghastly layer to the symphony of crisis. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck, my scrubs clinging to my skin. My role was to anticipate needs, to have the next instrument, the next medication ready before it was asked for. But my thoughts were a tangled mess of protocol and a screaming internal prayer. Every falter of the heart monitor was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that made me want to double over. I wasn't just watching a patient crash, I was watching a universe flicker. The challenge was no longer just medical, it was spiritual. How could a spirit so bright, a perception so profound, be so physically fragile? The dichotomy was devastating. We were a team of highly trained individuals, armed with the best technology and knowledge, fighting to save a life, but it felt like we were trying to grasp smoke. We were trying to repair a vessel that contained an ocean of unseen light, and the vessel was springing leaks faster than we could patch them. Another alarm sounded, a different, sharper tone this time. indicating a dangerous drop in oxygen saturation. It was a cascade, one system failing and pulling the next down with it. The anesthesiologist adjusted the ventilator settings, his movements swift and precise, but the numbers on the screen were stubborn, refusing to climb. "Come on, Alara," I heard him whisper, a raw, personal plea that broke through the clinical facade. "Fight." But that was the cruelest part of it all. Alara wasn't a fighter in the conventional sense. She was an acceptor, a perceiver. Her strength was in her serene embrace of the world as she felt it, not in a violent struggle against it. And now, her body was engaged in a struggle she had never asked for, a battle that her peaceful mind would never have chosen. The conflict felt like a profound violation of her very essence. The surgeons worked with a frantic, controlled desperation, their hands moving in a blur, trying to tie off the last crucial vessel, to relieve the final bit of pressure, to give her body the chance it needed to recover. The minutes bled together, a torturous stretch of time where hope became a thin, fraying thread. I found my gaze fixed not on the complex procedure, but on her face, still and peaceful beneath the anesthesia, so innocent of the storm raging within her and around her. I thought of her mother, Clara, sitting in the stark, unforgiving light of the waiting room, her entire world reduced to the periodic, vague updates a nervous volunteer would bring. How could anyone possibly convey what was happening in here? How could you explain that we were not just fighting for a heart to beat, but for a unique way of seeing to survive? The weight of that responsibility was a physical pressure on my shoulders, a burden that made it hard to draw a full breath. The challenges were mounting, each more insurmountable than the last. The failing physiology, the relentless march of time, the crushing weight of knowing exactly what was at stake. We were racing against an invisible clock, and the ticking was the increasingly weak and irregular sound of her heartbeat, a sound that was slowly, agonizingly, beginning to fade. The light in the room, once so bright and clinical, now seemed to dim, as if the very illumination of the world was tied to the fragile rhythm on that screen. We were facing the ultimate complication, the one from which there is no return, and the silence that had once been filled with her profound wisdom was now filled with the deafening, desperate sound of our collective failure closing in. And then, in the space between one faltering beep and the next, the lead surgeon's voice cut through the suffocating tension, not with panic, but with a renewed, fierce determination. "I've got it. The decompression is complete. The pressure is releasing." His words were a life raft thrown into a stormy sea, but we were all still drowning, our eyes locked on the cardiac monitor that continued to paint a picture of a system in collapse. The primary threat had been addressed, but the damage had already cascaded through her body. Her heart, a young and resilient muscle, was struggling to remember its rhythm under the pharmacological onslaught and the trauma it had just endured. The anesthesiologist was calling out numbers, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos, but the numbers were not improving. The oxygen saturation remained dangerously low, and her blood pressure was a mere whisper on the screen. It felt like we had won a battle only to face the imminent loss of the war. I found my hand gripping the edge of the instrument table, my knuckles white, my entire being focused on that screen, sending every ounce of my own willpower across the room, a silent, desperate plea for her heart to strengthen, to fight, to remember the vibrant life it was meant to sustain. The memory of her voice, so clear and full of a light we couldn't see, was now a screaming contradiction to the cold, hard data telling us she was slipping away. The surgeons began the frantic process of closing, their speed breathtaking, but it still felt too slow. Agonizingly slow, as if time itself had become thick and syrupy, holding us back from saving her. Another medication was administered, a powerful agent to shock her system back into stability. And we all watched, our collective breath held for any sign, any tiny flicker of improvement. The seconds ticked by, each one a lifetime of anguish. And then it happened. The erratic, sluggish line on the monitor gave a single, stronger, more defined spike. Then another, and another. It was hesitant at first, like a child learning to walk, but it was there. A rhythm was reasserting itself. The beeping, which had been a terrifying stutter, began to steady, to find its cadence again. The oxygen saturation number on the adjacent monitor twitched, and then, with a painstaking slowness that made my chest ache, it began to climb. 1 point, then 2. It was working. The cascade was stopping. The free fall was over. A shuddering, collective exhale seemed to move through the entire operating room. A wave of relief so potent it was almost dizzying. The surgeons exchanged a look, a brief, wordless communication that conveyed a universe of shared tension and tentative victory. The anesthesiologist leaned back slightly, running a hand over his brow, his shoulders slumping for the first time in what felt like hours. The worst was over. She was stable. The delicate vessel that contained Alara's extraordinary world had been patched, and it was holding. The immediate, visceral threat had passed, and we were left in the aftermath, our bodies buzzing with spent adrenaline, our minds struggling to process the emotional whiplash from certain loss to fragile hope. They finished closing with a methodical care that felt, now, like a form of reverence. The final suture was placed, the drapes were removed, and there she was, just a girl again. Small and pale on the big table, surrounded by the evidence of her brutal fight. But she was breathing. Her heart was beating a strong, steady rhythm. The silence that returned was different from the one her words had created. That had been a silence of awe. This was a silence of exhaustion, of profound gratitude, and of a dawning realization of the miracle we had just witnessed. Not just the medical one, but the human one. We had not just saved a patient, we had preserved a perspective. A way of being that had, in a few short sentences, illuminated the blindness in all of us. The journey to the recovery room was a quiet procession. I walked alongside her gurney, my hand resting lightly on its rail, as if I could transmit some of my own strength to her through the cold metal. She was still deep under the anesthesia, her face serene and untouched by the storm that had just raged within and around her. I thought of her mother, and a new kind of tension built inside me, the anxiety of delivering news that could either shatter a soul or piece it back together. How do you tell a mother that her daughter almost died, but that she also taught a room full of seasoned medical professionals how to see? This journey with Alara reminded me that the most profound stories are often born in the quietest, most unexpected moments. Her voice in that sterile room changed something in me forever. And I believe everyone has a story like that, a moment of unexpected light or a lesson learned in the dark. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think or feel something, I invite you to join our community here. By subscribing, you're not just following a channel, you're becoming part of a circle where we share these glimpses of humanity, these reminders of what truly matters. And I would be so honored if you felt comfortable sharing your own story in the comments. What is a moment that redefined something for you? A kindness you witnessed, a word that changed your perspective, a challenge that showed you your own strength. Your stories are the light that connects us all, and I would genuinely love to read them. The journey from the operating room to the intensive care unit felt like crossing a bridge between two different worlds, one a frantic, high-stakes battle, and the other of vigilant, hopeful watchfulness. I stayed by Ilara's side, my hand never leaving the cold rail of her gurney, as if my physical connection could somehow tether her spirit more firmly to this world. The stark, bright lights of the hallway seemed softer now, or perhaps it was just my own perception, forever altered by the profound peace she had exuded, even in the face of oblivion. In the ICU, a new kind of silence took over, punctuated not by the frantic beeps of crisis, but by the steady, rhythmic sounds of monitoring, a gentle, electronic lullaby that promised stability and careful observation. The nurses there took over with their quiet efficiency, connecting her to new machines, setting up the IV pumps that would deliver a careful cocktail of pain medication and antibiotics, their movements a ballet of practiced care. I provided the handoff report, my voice surprisingly steady as I recounted the medical facts, the successful decompression, the intraoperative bradycardia, the pharmacological intervention, the stabilization. But how could I possibly convey the rest? How could I put into words the spiritual earthquake that had preceded the medical one? I simply said, "She is extraordinary." And the receiving nurse, a woman named Anya with kind eyes, just nodded slowly, as if she understood that some stories transcended clinical summaries. Leaving Ilara in their capable hands was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, but my next duty was even more daunting. I had to face Clara. I walked towards the family waiting room, my shoes squeaking on the linoleum, each step echoing the heavy beat of my own heart. The air in that corridor felt thick with the collective anxiety of a dozen other families, each living their own private hell of uncertainty. I pushed the door open, and Clara was right there, as if she had been standing by the door the entire time. Her face was pale and streaked with dried tears, her eyes wide with a desperate, searching hope. She didn't speak. She just looked at me, her entire soul in her gaze, waiting for the verdict that would define the rest of her life. I moved to her quickly, placing a hand on her arm. "Clara," I said, my voice soft but clear. "She's out of surgery. She's stable." The words hung in the air for a moment before they truly landed. Then a sob broke from her, not of sorrow, but of sheer, unadulterated relief. She collapsed into my arms, her body shaking with the force of her emotion. And I held her tightly, this woman I had only known for a day, feeling her tremors as if they were my own. "It was touch and go for a few minutes," I continued, my voice low near her ear. Her heart struggled, but the surgeons were able to complete the procedure, and she responded to the medication. She's a fighter. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't the right word. Ilara hadn't fought. She had endured. She had embodied a stillness that was more powerful than any struggle. I guided Clara to the ICU, explaining that Ilara would be sedated for a while longer, that she would be swollen, that there would be tubes and wires, but that the vital signs were strong. When we entered the room and Clara saw her daughter, so small and pale amidst the tangle of technology, she let out a small, choked cry and rushed to the bedside. She carefully, so carefully, took Ilara's limp hand in both of her own, bringing it to her lips. She began to whisper to her, a stream of loving words, of gratitude, of promises for the future. I stood back, giving them this sacred space, this first reunion. I watched as Clara's trembling stilled, as her posture shifted from one of terror to one of protective, unwavering love. She was no longer just a worried mother, She was a guardian stationed at the side of a miracle. My shift had ended hours ago, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I found a quiet corner in the nurse's station, updating charts mechanically. But my attention was perpetually drawn to the monitor displaying Ilara's vitals from room 4. That steady, green rhythm was the most beautiful sight in the world. The next 24 hours were a slow, meticulous unwinding of the tension. Ilara's sedation was gradually lightened, and we all watched with bated breath for her to emerge from the chemical fog. Her mother rarely left her side, sleeping fitfully in the uncomfortable recliner, her hand always in contact with some part of her daughter, a foot, an arm, her hair. I checked in on them frequently, each time feeling that same surge of protective warmth. On the second day, as the morning sun streamed into the room, I was there when Ilara's eyelids first fluttered. It was a slow, heavy movement. Clara leaned forward, her breath catching. "Ilara, baby, can you hear me? It's Mom." There was a long pause. Ilara's brow furrowed slightly, a tiny sign of consciousness returning. Her hand twitched in her mother's grasp, and then her lips, dry and cracked, parted. Her voice was a faint, raspy whisper, barely more than an exhale. "Mom," she breathed, the beeping is slower now." It was such an Ilara thing to say. Her first conscious observation was not a complaint of pain or disorientation, but a note on the changed soundscape of her environment. Clara let out a watery laugh, a sound of pure, unbridled joy, and kissed her forehead repeatedly. "Yes, my love," she whispered back, her voice thick with tears. "The beeping is slower. Everything is okay." That was the true beginning of the resolution, the moment the fragile hope solidified into a tangible, breathing reality. Over the next few days, Ilara's strength returned in small, incremental steps. The tube was removed from her throat, and her voice, though weak, regained its melodic clarity. The swelling around her eyes and face began to subside. She never once complained about the pain, only asking for descriptions of who was in the room, what the light was like, what the weather was doing outside. The hospital staff, from the physicians to the cleaning crew, all seemed to treat her room with a special kind of reverence. Word of what she had said in the OR had spread, not as gossip, but as a kind of modern-day parable. People would find excuses to pop in, not just to perform a duty, but to simply be in the presence of the girl who saw with her heart. Dr. Pruitt, Rossi stopped by on his rounds, not just to check her incisions, but to ask her, genuinely, how she was feeling. The lead surgeon, a man known for his stoicism, spent an extra 5 minutes just sitting with her, listening as she described the difference between the sound of day shift and night shift. We were all students in her quiet classroom. The crisis was over. The conflict had been resolved not just by surgical skill and medication, but by the sheer, luminous force of Ilara's spirit, which had somehow guided us all through the darkness. The path to her recovery was clear now, marked by physical therapy sessions and follow-up scans. But it was also a path of collective healing for everyone she had touched. We had set out to fix a broken part of her, but in the end, she had fixed a broken part of our sight, teaching us to see the world not just with our eyes, but with our entire beings. Ilara's discharge from the hospital was not a loud, celebratory affair, but a quiet, The day she left, the sun was shining, and someone had thoughtfully opened the blinds in her room, allowing a pool of golden light to spill across the floor. Clara was packing the few belongings they had accumulated, her movements light, almost buoyant with a relief that had now settled deep into her bones. Ilara was sitting in a chair, dressed in her own clothes again. A simple cotton dress that she asked her mother to describe in detail, The color of the sky after a storm, Clara had said, a soft, hopeful gray blue. I stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching them, this mother and daughter who had forever altered the landscape of my heart. My role in their story was officially ending, but I knew the echoes of it would resonate within me for the rest of my life. I walked in to give the final discharge instructions, my voice calm and familiar. But my emotions were a turbulent sea beneath the professional surface. When I finished, I knelt down beside Ilara's chair. "You're all set to go home," I said, my hand instinctively covering hers. She turned her head toward me, her clouded hazel eyes seeming to look directly into my soul, and that small, knowing smile I had seen on the first day returned to her lips. "Thank you, Catherine," she said, her voice as clear and melodic as it had been before any of this began, "for your quick, light footsteps, for being my anchor." I couldn't speak around the lump in my throat. I just squeezed her hand, hoping she could feel the immense gratitude and love I was pouring into that simple touch. As a nurse, you are trained not to get too attached, but some people walk into your care and immediately dismantle those walls. Ilara hadn't just dismantled them, she had shown me there was no need for them in the first place. I helped her into a wheelchair, my hands lingering on the handles as we began the slow journey down the hallway. It was a reverse pilgrimage of the frantic trip we had taken to the OR, what felt like a lifetime ago. This time, the pace was slow, deliberate. The other nurses at the station looked up and smiled, a few offering soft words of goodbye and good luck. They knew. They all knew they were witnessing something special departing their halls. We reached the hospital entrance, the automatic door sliding open with a quiet whoosh, unleashing a wave of outside air, a complex symphony of car exhaust, distant chatter, and the sweet, living scent of a city breathing. Ilara tilted her head back, inhaling deeply. "It smells like possibility," she whispered, and I felt a fresh wave of tears prick my eyes. Clara's car was pulled up to the curb, and as we helped Ilara stand and transition from the chair to the passenger seat, she paused, one hand on the car door, the other still holding mine. "I will remember the sound of your heart," she said to me, her voice soft but sure. "It's steady, like a deep drum. It sounds like safety." And then she was in the car, the door was closed, and with a final wave from Clara, they pulled away from the curb and merged into the flow of traffic, becoming just another car in the stream of life. I stood there for a long time, watching until the car was completely out of sight. The space where it had been, now filled with the ordinary comings and goings of a normal day. I felt a profound sense of loss, but it was a clean loss, the kind you feel when a beautiful piece of music ends. You are sad it's over, but so grateful you were there to hear it. Back inside, the hospital hummed with its usual rhythm, but for me, everything was different. The sharp scent of disinfectant no longer smelled just of chemicals. It now carried the faint, ghostly memory of lemon. A note of perception gifted to me by a girl who saw with her nose. The squeak of shoes on linoleum was no longer just noise. It was a library of identities, each gate telling a story I had now learned to listen for. The beeping of monitors was not just a clinical sound, but a testament to the fragile, incredible rhythm of life that I had witnessed falter and then fiercely reclaim its beat. I went back to my duties, checking on other patients, administering medications. But I was moving through the world with a new set of senses, a new understanding that had been carved into me. This was the how of the hook, the answer to the question of how a few words in a silent operating room could stun everyone into a reverent silence. It wasn't just the words themselves, though they were beautiful and profound. It was the perfect, undeniable truth behind them, delivered by a messenger who lived that truth with every fiber of her being. It was the shocking realization that in our frantic pursuit to fix, to cure, to make people see the world as we do, we had become blind to the vast, vibrant landscapes that exist beyond the narrow scope of our vision. Ilara, in her ultimate moment of vulnerability, with her body broken and her life in our hands, had been the only one who was truly clear-sighted. She held up a mirror to our collective blindness, and in her calm, clear voice, she showed us that the light we so desperately seek with our eyes is often brightest when felt with the heart. The moral of this journey, the spiritual truth that now guides my every interaction, is that perception is not a singular sense, but a full-bodied experience. We are all, in our own ways, navigating a world we can only partially comprehend, building our realities from the fragments of sound, scent, touch, and emotion that we gather. Ilara's world was not a lesser one. A world of darkness. It was a world of different light, constructed with such exquisite detail and profound appreciation that it put my own rushed, visual reality to shame. She taught me that courage isn't always about fighting the darkness. Sometimes it's about having the quiet faith to perceive the light within it. Her strength was not in defiance, but in acceptance, a deep spiritual surrender to the reality of her experience, which in turn gave her a power that was unshakable. I now understand that my purpose as a nurse and as a human being is not just to heal bodies, but to honor the unique, invisible worlds that each person carries inside them. To be a witness, to be an anchor, and to remember that the most profound diagnoses and the most miraculous cures often have nothing to do with medical charts and everything to do with the human spirit's capacity to find light, to create color, and to see beauty in ways that defy all physical limitation. Ilara's final lesson was that we are all, in a sense, blind, fumbling through an existence we think we understand. But if we have the courage to close our eyes, to truly listen, to feel, and to love, we might just discover that the most breathtaking vistas are not in front of our eyes, but within the boundless, luminous landscape of the human heart. And that is a sight that no surgery can ever give, and no darkness can ever take away.